In order to evacuate the ravaged Philippine island, General Douglas MacArthur, his wife Jean, and their 4-year-old son, Arthur, stepped out onto Corregidor's North Dock early on the evening of March 11, 1942. As Japanese forces advanced, MacArthur's garrison would soon be overrun. The general, his family, and a few trusted advisors would go 500 miles south in 2 days on 4 Navy PT boats to the lush island of Mindanao. There, they would be picked up at a pineapple farm in Del Monte by B-17 bombers sent from Australia and flown to Darwin, a port city. Young Arthur gripped his white plush rabbit as MacArthur assisted his family into the boat. Then, for one last glance at the charred rock stronghold, the general turned. With its trees, shrubs, and flowers, the bright green foliage was no longer there, he observed. Everything that grew was gone, including the sheds and buildings. The general's gaze landed on his soldiers, who gazed at him silently. The 2 most valuable individuals in MacArthur's life, his wife and kid, would accompany him along with his suitcase, musette bag, and walnut cane. Thousands of American families' husbands, sons, and brothers would be left behind by him. Families who had put their faith in him. Soon after Corregidor Island fell and the terrible Bataan Death March began, those soldiers would endure years of Japanese torture and brutality. Others would be imprisoned within Japan's infamous hell ships, or perish from malnutrition, malaria, and diarrhea. General Douglas MacArthur left, meets with his chief of staff, Majib's, General Richard Sutherland, in his headquarters tunnel on the Philippine island of Corregidor just before the commander of the U.S. The Far Eastern Army forces were transported to Australia. Beyond his soldiers, MacArthur's beloved Manila was destined for a cruel 3-year occupation that would result in widespread starvation and even graveyard looting, as desperate citizens stole jewelry, clothing, and even dentures from the dead. Anything that could be sold or bartered for a few pesos to purchase a fistful of rice. This was a loss. In a final salute, the general lifted his cap. He subsequently wrote, "The night air was thickened by the smell of filth. I could feel the muscles in my face twitch convulsively, and my face turned white." "Sarge, what's his chance?" a soldier asked, and MacArthur heard it. "Dunno," was the response. "Perhaps 1 out of 5. The vessel withdrew from the pier and pointed toward the ocean. As Corregidor melted away in the foamy aftermath, MacArthur made a serious commitment that would motivate him as the weeks became months and finally years, a promise he would make to reporters when he arrived safely in Australia a few days later. "I'll be back." Giving up the Philippines was more than just a tactical withdrawal for MacArthur. The loss was personal. The father of the general was a military governor of America's new colony after aiding in the seizure of Manila during the Spanish-American War. Set along Manila's stunning bay, the Philippine capital has evolved into a small slice of America in Asia over the 4 decades of U.S. administration. It is a metropolis of Spanish colonial and exquisite neoclassical buildings, blended with expansive parks. For war crimes, General Tomoyuki Yamashita was prosecuted, found guilty, and put to death. Numerous American servicemen and workers at firms such as General Electric, Del Monte, and BF, with social clubs, golf courses, swimming pools, and movie theaters, Goodrich was known as the Pearl of the Orient and enjoyed the laid-back lifestyle. In 1932, the New York Times remarked, "Manila is by far the most beautiful of all cities in the Orient. It appears to be half hidden in a canopy of trees, green everywhere, a city within a park from the top of the University Club." Douglas MacArthur's life was entwined with the Philippines, just like his father's. Following his graduation from West Point in 1903, MacArthur was first assigned to the islands. He returned time and time again, serving in more senior roles and developing intimate links with key figures. As the son of a career military officer who had spent his life bouncing about the globe, MacArthur famously wrote, "My mother had died, my wife had been courted, and my son had been born in this city. Manila was the closest thing he had to a hometown." He wrote of his stay there, "With my little family, I would be lonely no more. the Pearl of the Orient was adored by many people besides Douglas MacArthur. According to CBS News correspondent Bill Dunn, to live in Manila in 1941 was to experience the good life. However, on December 7, 1941, the pleasant life came to an end. MacArthur ordered his troops to evacuate to the Bataan Peninsula and the fortified island of Corregidor after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. In an attempt to save the Pearl of the Orient from being destroyed, he declared Manila to be an open city. MacArthur was forced to give up his cherished library, his wife's jewelry and family silver, and even his father's Civil War memorabilia in the haste to fit the family's life into just 2 suitcases. On January 2, 1942, the Japanese took control of Manila, forcing hundreds of American citizens into the University of Santo Tomas's 50-acre internment camp. Before leaving, MacArthur spent 77 days in the Corregidor tunnels. The city suffered greatly during Japan's nearly 3-year occupation. Japanese troops pillaged department stores, stole cars and medications, and seized stocks of rice, sugar, and canned goods. The economy crashed and fields withered. The streets were crowded with beggars. Many of them were young. According to a 1944 American intelligence report, it is a common sight nowadays in the crowded streets of Manila that a mother, with tears in her eyes, sells her child to whoever may pay her the agreed-upon amount in cash. Up to 500 people perished from famine every day. Families of Americans living behind the walls of Santo Tomas subsisted on dogs, cats, and even rats, which sold for 8 pesos on the illegal market in the camp. Robert Colquhoun, an internee, recalled, "I liked Whiskers, my pet cat, but when the time came, I just picked him up and put him up for slaughter." MacArthur spent the war scything his way north from Australia over New Guinea as commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific Theater, with every success bringing him one step closer to his homeland. The general scolded President Franklin Roosevelt during a July 1944 summit in Hawaii when senior Navy officials suggested that America avoid the Philippines in its march toward Japan, which would nullify MacArthur's pledge to return. 3 American divisions surrounded the Japanese, who attempted to repel them with 17,000 soldiers facing the harbor. Incredulous, Roosevelt complied with MacArthur's demands and went to bed that night, calling his doctor and requesting an aspirin. "Give me another aspirin to take in the morning," the president remarked. Just hours before his soldiers attacked the beaches of Lingayen Gulf on January 9, 1945, 110 miles north of Manila and 2 years, 9 months, and 29 days after his escape, MacArthur spoke to his aides over breakfast, expressing the pressure he was under. He declared, "I will never ask the Lord for so much again, if he allows me to land this one." American war planners separated the capital, which was home to an estimated 1 million people, in order to free it. From the north, Major General Vern D. Mudge's 1st Cavalry Division and Major General Robert S. Beichler's 37th Infantry would advance. The 37th would enter Manila, cross the Pasig River close to Malacañang Palace, then head west and head for the waterfront of the capital. The 1st Cavalry would parallel the infantry's movements by encircling the capital from the east, crossing the river farther south, and then turning toward the bay. Meanwhile, the 11th Airborne Division would lock the back door of the city by moving in from the south. Japan had sent Tomoyuki Yamashita, a 59-year-old general who had earlier in the war gained the moniker the Tiger of Malaya for capturing Singapore and Malaysia from the British, to thwart MacArthur. However, because of their rivalry, War Minister Hideki Tojo sent Yamashita to Manchuria to protect against a potential Russian invasion, so sidelining him for the most of the war. However, Tojo was overthrown and Yamashita was resurrected as a result of the Marianas' collapse in the summer of 1944. With orders to bog down MacArthur and turn the Philippines into a tar pit, the husky general was dispatched to Manila. Emperor Hirohito forewarned him that, "You bear the responsibility for the destiny of the empire." However, like MacArthur earlier in the war, Yamashita had no intention of fighting for the city, since once the Americans arrived, the starved citizens would turn against his men. In an attempt to utilize the untamed terrain against the Americans, he instead split his soldiers up into multiple geographic commands and sent them to the highlands and jungles of Luzon. However, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi had other ideas. Iwabuchi's task as commander of the Manila Naval Defense Force was to remain behind and destroy the shoreline and port, so that American forces would not have access to the vital resource. His orders, which he had no intention of following, required him to leave the city once they were finished. After American forces destroyed his battleship, the Kirishima, near Guadalcanal early in the war, the 49-year-old had been a failed skipper. An insult to any maritime commander in times of war, Iwabuchi had been seated behind a desk for the remainder of the conflict. Iwabuchi had only been given a second opportunity because of Japan's declining fortunes and the passing of other, more qualified officers. Iwabuchi saw Manila as an opportunity to make amends by staging a Stalingrad-style urban bloodletting. He achieved this by dividing his 17,000 Marines and soldiers into many commands that served Manila's central, southern, and northern regions. In the end, Iwabuchi's strategy planned for a last line of defense based on Intramuros, the historic Spanish castle with imposing stone walls overlooking Manila Bay. Iwabuchi designed a defensive perimeter of massive concrete structures that resembled miniature fortresses and were constructed to withstand earthquakes and typhoons around the walled city. Rooms containing workstations, seats, and bookcases were blocked off by Japanese troops. Troops constructed staggered walls in the hallways, each 4 feet thick and 7 feet high, with just enough space between them to throw hand grenades. In addition, Iwabuchi's troops turned depth charges into landmines and booby-trapped dozens of crossings by driving railroad ties into the pavement. As American troops moved in, the Japanese slaughtered citizens in Manila, some with their hands tied behind their backs. MacArthur was still certain that the Japanese would leave the city in spite of these defensive measures, which were communicated to American forces via radio by Filipino rebels. The commander ordered his staff to organize a freedom parade since he was so sure of this reality. But the contradicting intelligence made things more difficult for American combat planners. Guerrilla communications from the beginning of December indicated Yamashita's plan to leave the city. However, the communications shifted by January, indicating Iwabuchi's intention to garrison Manila, following Yamashita's departure from the capital for the mountains surrounding Baguio. According to one letter, Japs erect pillboxes, trenches, and roadblock on main streets. Another said, defensive preparation of civilian homes. Residents were alarmed as they observed the city's fortification. With good reason, those who had longed for MacArthur's return for years are now concerned about the torment that liberation may bring. Japanese forces warned, very few of you will live to see the Americans. On February 3, 1945, at 6:35 p.m., men from the 1st Cavalry Division arrived in Manila with the goal of reaching the University of Santo Tomas, where internees were starving to death at a rate of 3 or 4 per day. The daily calorie intake had fallen to 572 during the last month of detention. The Americans were flooded with internees. We were so excited and happy that we went crazy. In her diary, one internee wrote, "We cheered, shouted, screamed, clapped, and wept." However, the thrill was short-lived. Iwabuchi ordered the demolition of Manila to start that same day. MacArthur's assistant, Colonel Courtney Whitney, witnessed the events from a rooftop at Santo Tomas as incendiary squads destroyed the bridges over the Pasig River and rushed through the northern parts of the city, dynamiting buildings. On February 6, 1945, a crew of anti-tank guns gets ready to halt a predicted Japanese offensive. He stated in a letter, "Last night was a night of horror in Manila. The city was rocked by terrible explosions from the enemy demolitions, and massive flames erupted up thousands of feet, giving the impression that the entire city was on fire." The 37th Infantry Division's commander, Major General Robert Beitler, swore over what he now understood to be a calculated plot to demolish the capital. "We had no way of knowing which of the thousands of places the demolitions were being controlled. We were powerless to stop it," he stated in his report. Very large, contemporary office buildings made of steel and reinforced concrete were literally blown from their foundations and settled crazily in twisted heaps. Flames leapt from building to building, forcing infantrymen caught in the blaze to retreat. Keisho Laban Nip of the 148th Infantry Regiment recalled, "Japs popped out of alleys and buildings trying to escape the fire. We fired first because we were prepared. The majority of the men in the lead fired from the hip and tossed grenades." Browning automatic rifle-wielding troops advanced to the front. First Sergeant Roy, Bus McMurray, stated, "We killed every Jap we saw, making quite a hole. Our street was almost completely cut off by the fire at one point. In a hurry, we had to charge through the opening. I questioned whether we would survive because of the intense heat and the walls of fire around us." The city north of the river was in American control by February 7, 1945, while the city south of the river was under Japanese authority. Troops were forced to make the treacherous boat crossing because all the bridges were perched on the muddy bottom of the Pasig. The assault boats and the amphibious tractors that were deployed to retrieve them became the targets of Iwabuchi's soldiers' withering fire. Major Chuck Henne of the 148th Infantry Regiment recalled, "The smoke, flash, and bang could not have been staged more dramatically in Hollywood. Watching paddle fragments and splintered boat plywood pieces fly through the air, while men, apparently unaware of what was happening to them, paddled with broken oars and rifles to work their boats to the far bank was captivating." During the battle for Manila, Major General Vernon D. Mudge, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, talks with a few of his subordinates. In the meantime, the 11th Airborne Division ran into the Genko Line, a strong German defensive on the city's southern edge. From Nichols Field at Manila Bay Northeast to Fort McKinley, the Japanese established a defensive line with 1,200 pillboxes, anti-aircraft weapons, and machine gun nests in anticipation of an American invasion from the south. To make matters more difficult, the Japanese planted 500-pound aerial bombs in the city's entrance roadways and turned depth charges into landmines. The historian for the 11th Airborne Division, Edward Flanagan, stated, "From this point on, our advance was not measured in miles. Yards were used to measure it." The infantrymen fought house to house, using demolition charges and flamethrowers to attack pillboxes and bunkers after the American artillery cleared the way. Overhead, Japanese anti-aircraft shells detonated, causing a rain of steel that shredded leaves and branches from trees and pockmarked houses. "Our drive into Manila was characterized by chaos and destruction," Flanagan wrote. "Both Japanese and American artillery destroyed homes and businesses that were located on either side of the highway that goes to the city center. Once pretentious homes gauntly displayed burnt chimneys and garbage piles of wreckage, while tin-roofed dwellings appeared as if they had been split through by a big can opener." The battle for Nichols Field was intense. The Japanese had unobstructed views of any approaching Americans due to the large open space. The region was surrounded by barbed wire, airplane revetments were strengthened, and tunnels connecting gun emplacements and concrete pillboxes, one of which was 3 stories deep and discovered to contain a mahogany bed, were excavated by enemy Marines. 5-inch naval guns taken from demolished battleships were used by the defenders to line the airfield's outer perimeter. Before the last of the enemy at the field were annihilated, the battle would eventually stretch on until February 13th. As if the Emperor's palace were situated in the middle of the runway, Flanagan wrote, "The Japanese defended Nichols Field." Iwabuchi knew the battle was lost by February 9th, only 6 days after American troops had entered the city. While MacArthur's defenses along the southern edge of Manila were in danger of collapsing, his men had crossed the river and entered the city's center. One of the saddest human tragedies of World War II resulted from what had begun as a battle between 2 armies for one of Asia's major cities. In pursuit of enemy locations, a lone Sherman tank cautiously patrols the capital's broken streets. Almost all of the Japanese defenders perished. An analysis of the chronology of the dozens of crimes that took place in Manila indicates that February 9th was the turning point in the violence, which went from isolated assaults on suspected rebels to coordinated mass murder. The crimes were not isolated incidents of unrelated violence, but rather were part of a systematic strategy to demolish the city and wipe out its residents, as would subsequently be shown by captured Japanese orders discovered on the battlefield. Some were only pieces, while others were signed and dated. There are thousands of Filipino insurgents and around 1,000 artillery troops among the Americans who have infiltrated Manila. According to one order, even women and children have turned into guerrillas. Every individual on the battlefield will be executed, except for Japanese military personnel, Japanese civilians, and special construction units. The city was, of course, that battlefield. Instructions on how to best eliminate civilians were provided by other orders. One order stipulated that, when Filipinos are to be killed, they must be gathered into one place and disposed of, with the consideration that ammunition and manpower must not be used to excess. Dead bodies should be brought inside homes that are slated to be destroyed or demolished. Since disposing of them is a difficult task, they ought to be dumped into the river as well. At the German club, more than 500 people were burned to death by Japanese forces. Another 400 males were captured and killed by troops in the Paco sector, 200 of whom were beheaded. Another 360 men, women, and children were slain by Marines in the St. Paul's College dining hall. After more than 50 victims were massacred inside the Red Cross headquarters, John Louis, a Jewish refugee from Germany, survived. Louis later told war crimes investigators, "I thought it was a dream when I woke up, but everyone was dead." Numerous small-scale crimes sometimes accompanied these massive massacres, as raiding troops killed families in their houses, dragged others from bomb shelters, and slaughtered them in the streets. The Japanese even planted a Red Cross banner to entice victims into an open lot on Kansas Street. One survivor subsequently told American investigators, "The Japanese wanted to be sure that everybody was dead." The attacks were more than just murder. At the Bayview Hotel, the opulent establishment with a view of Manila Bay where John MacArthur formerly resided and took in the city's renowned sunsets, dozens of women were rounded up and subjected to sexual assault. That night, I experienced between 12 and 15 rapes. I can't recall how many times. Esther Garcia Moras subsequently stated in her testimony, "It turned into a living nightmare because I was so exhausted and horrified." In light of this tragedy, American troops advanced farther into the city. Manila was being completely wrecked by American firepower and Japanese demolitions. As the hours stretched into days, men, women, and children went underground, where the conditions within small air raid shelters deteriorated. Originally intended for a single household, bunkers occasionally housed several. The air was stagnant and stifled by the foul odors of urine and vomit due to the large number of humans packed together. There was a lot of intense warfare in Intramuros, the old walled neighborhood of Manila that was constructed during the Spanish colonial era. On February 12th, Japanese forces used the Manila post office, which is bombarded by the United States. Hans Steiner, an Austrian, described his experience in a letter to his mother. He wrote, "We lived like dogs. There were explosions and burning all around us. It was the greatest thing a person could imagine." American soldiers fought block by block, hampered by intersection fortifications that forced men to burst through nearby buildings to strike the back of a pillbox. The blocked buildings where Japanese Marines dropped aerial bombs and even Molotov cocktails from upper-level windows were as dangerous. According to Major Chuck Henney, the preferred solution was to use cannon to blast the upper floors to rubble and then move in. Burning the structure was an equally popular option. Riflemen moved in to occupy the building floor by floor after these options failed. The fierce combat that American troops encountered across Manila was typified by the struggle for Rizal Hall, the biggest structure on the University of the Philippines campus. The 3-story building was fiercely defended by Japanese Marines who had barricaded the tunnels. They even attempted to blow it up when the Americans and themselves were inside. As nightfall descended on the city on February 22nd, American cavalrymen and Japanese Marines readied themselves to share the ruined structure for the night, as neither side was willing to concede territory. Using machine guns and grenades, Iwabuchi's Marines attacked the Americans on the second floor about 8 p.m. According to the 5th Cavalry Regiment's report, the Japs paused for approximately 10 minutes before launching a second attack after the holding force had been involved in the firefight for approximately 30 minutes. The Japanese withdrew after this subsequent attack was repulsed in 20 minutes, and they stopped firing. To attack enemy forces hunkered in Fort Santiago and Intramuros, American troops crossed the Pasig River. In the darkened building, the Americans waited for another attack to occur as soon as the moon went down. With nothing to do but wait, listen, and worry, the men became silent. Cavalrymen heard enemy voices at the far end of the structure about 1:30 in the morning. According to the cavalry's report, at first they seemed to be conversational tones, but gradually increased into a weird chant until there was a full chorus of singing. There were numerous reports of grenades and dynamite charges exploding immediately after this commotion, which lasted for approximately 45 minutes, ended with a final outburst of song and loud shouting. The cavalrymen kept listening. Other grenades went off. Then there was quiet. Until about 4 a.m., when a permanent silence descended upon the structure, explosions occurred every 30 minutes. When an assault squad arrived the next morning, they found 19 victims in the first chamber, all of them mutilated by explosives in what the cavalry report called an appalling sight. However, the slaughter did not end there. According to the report, more bodies exhibiting the same manner of death were found at the foot of the staircase and in the 5 adjoining rooms. The ritual that our troops had listened to in the early morning hours had been completed by 77 people in total. Early on February 23rd, American Marines prepared for the attack on Intramuros, the historic stronghold that had repelled attackers for over 3 centuries. The 160-acre citadel was defended by 2.5 miles of imposing stone walls that climbed up to 22 feet in some spots, housing an estimated 2,000 enemy soldiers. An estimated 4,000 male civilians who would have posed a threat if MacArthur's forces broke through the walls were killed in recent weeks by Japanese troops who had been preparing to make a last stand in the walled city. On February 17th, men from the 37th Infantry Division scale a wall's debris in Intramuros. Both the individuals trapped in the crossfire and the old buildings suffered damage from modern weapons. War strategists recognized that the masses of women and children, some of whom the Japanese had shanghaied to use as human shields, made any battle more difficult. In addition, many of the civilians were on the verge of death, since they had already been starved before the fighting started. Days earlier, 18th Corps Commander Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold had tried to persuade the Japanese to free the civilians in an effort to save needless deaths. The public announcement said, "Your situation is hopeless. Your defeat is inevitable. I present an honorable surrender to you." But there was just quiet in response to him. Thus, it is a battle to the death, Griswold noted in his journal. At 7:30 a.m., artillery fired as the sun began to peak above the horizon. The first shots were observed by reporters, many of whom were encamped in General Griswold's command post on top of a burned-out building just north of the river. According to CBS's Bill Dunn, "I have seen naval bombardments, but nothing to match the concentrated fury of this barrage." It was 10 minutes. Next, 20. Each of the 120 pieces of artillery was a part of the Symphony of Doom as the guns thundered. Artillery would fire an incredible 78-96 rounds, or 185 tons of ammunition, in an hour. When that was paired with an additional 1,900 mortars, an average of 3 shells were launched every second of the onslaught. Major Henney said, "The gunpowder of modern artillery was no match for the old soft stones." For the residents who were Japanese hostages inside Intramuros, the shelling was utter dread as munitions crushed the old stones and created so much dust that it was difficult to breathe. According to survivor Benita Lajos, the smoke made it impossible for us to even see one another. We believed that we would all perish. The ground assault started around 8:30 a.m. when a plume of crimson smoke appeared over Intramuros's south wall, signaling the end of the artillery attack. Dunn remembered that the silence that followed seemed even louder than the bombardment. In order to cross the river, assault boats pushed away from the muddy bank. In order to stop any counterattacks on the ground forces, artillerymen simultaneously fired smoke mortars in front of the finance, agriculture, and legislature buildings, all of which were owned by the Japanese. At 8:33 a.m., infantrymen rushed across the golf course, which was charred and pocked. Troops clambered over the debris and entered the walled city 3 minutes after leaving the assault boats. According to Dunn, our troops moved in and the fighting within the walls began as dazed, half-crazed civilians moved out of the north wall toward the boats. Inside, the forces discovered a deserted city with narrow streets clogged with the remains of houses, businesses, and places of worship, making it difficult for the infantrymen to sift through the wreckage. According to one story, retaking the Intramuros turned into a small arms duel. In order to escape sniper fire, GIs dashed through downtown Manila. When street fighting broke out, resurgent as Japanese rounds buzzed overhead, Maynard Mahan ducked behind a block of concrete. He lighted a cigarette, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes for a moment. Nearby, a mortar exploded, showering stone all around him. Then he noticed that a piece of flying shrapnel had taken his cigarette. "Fuck it," he yelled. "My last butt was that one." To aid in the refugees' departure, American troops built a footbridge out of boards and pontoons. What remained of Intramuros' civilian population flowed across it. Those who weren't starved to death had cuts and wounds from bullets, New York Times writer George Jones reported. Chinese carrying litters on which lay sick, injured, or dying men, women, and children appeared at various points in this pathetic procession. The Americans had to find the few surviving German soldiers who had fled behind Fort Santiago's tall walls and taken refuge in the maze-like network of tunnels and damp dungeons. According to a report from the 37th Infantry Division, every conceivable technique was used, including gasoline and oil. It worked because when the situation calmed down and men started to enter these rooms, they discovered Japanese people piled high, having died a death as terrible as the thousands of defenseless civilians they slaughtered. At last, the fight for Intramuros was ended. A woman is carried by an American soldier from the Santa Clara Monastery's ruins in Intramuros, where residents had sought refuge. During the month-long conflict, an estimated 1,000 civilians lost their lives. The walled city's successful capture occurred at the comparatively cheap cost of 25 American casualties and 265 injured, according to General Griswold, who had witnessed the battle from a dilapidated hotel north of the Pasig. The 14th Corps commander wrote in his diary, "I am very thankful that God has been good to me today. I have no doubt that the fight for Manila will soon come to an end. It has been a lot of responsibility and stress." The legislature, agriculture, and finance buildings were the only 3 significant enemy strongholds left. An examination by Caprese Corps stated that the Japanese had carefully transformed the buildings into individual fortresses of the most formidable type, with sandbag gun emplacements and barricades in the doors and windows, covering all approaches to each building, as well as adjacent ones. Inside the buildings themselves, machine guns were positioned to fire down stairs, hallways, and even into rooms. There were only an estimated 700 Japanese Marines under Iwabuchi's command trapped inside, unlike in previous fights. The plan called for the 5th Cavalry to capture the agriculture building and the 148th Infantry Regiment to capture the finance and legislative buildings. The attack began with a heavy barrage of artillery. Astounded by the devastation, General Beitler, the 37th Division commander, said, "We made a churned-up pile of dust and scrap out of the imposing classic government buildings." The first level of the north wing and the first 2 floors of the main building were taken by infantrymen who stormed the legislature. 2 Japanese Marines were killed and 52 wounded, as lead was thrown on the infantrymen from pillboxes positioned in hallways and apartments. The battlefield came to a standstill. According to Army historian Robert Ross Smith, only the battered central portion, roofless and gutted, still stood above its wings like a ghost arising from between toppled tombstones, was the best way to describe the moment the infantry finally took control of the building at 6 p.m. on February 27th, after artillerymen resumed the battle and pounded the north and south wings. Iwabuchi commanded the remaining Marines at the neighboring agriculture building, which was hammered by the cavalry. At first, he pleaded with his soldiers to battle to the end. He declared, "We will use grenades if we run out of bullets. We will use swords to defeat the enemy if we run out of grenades. If our swords break, we will kill them by putting our teeth in their throats." But when the American weapons pounded the columns and tore wide holes in the concrete walls surrounding him, revealing the building's winding rebar veins, Iwabuchi's strength waned. Iwabuchi found himself encircled, outmanned, and outgunned. The admiral was aware that he was at the Iwabuchi oversaw one of the most heinous atrocities of World War II in the weeks following MacArthur's forces' assault on Manila, in which his soldiers ruthlessly murdered tens of thousands of men, women, and children in some of the most heinous and terrible ways imaginable. He was aware that survival was not an option. The brutality of the conflict is silently attested by a heap of dead Japanese soldiers. Iwabuchi gathered his army and expressed regret for guiding them to ruin. "Please make an escape if you have the guts to do so," he said. "If not, kindly end your lives right here." The admiral withdrew to his main floor lodgings on the northwest side of the structure. He cut open his abdomen with a knife. Under the cover of darkness, Japanese Marines tried to flee, but were shot down by American artillery. Meanwhile, artillery bombarded the structure until American soldiers eventually filled the few subterranean bunkers with gasoline drums and burned. According to the 5th Cavalry's report, it did not seem possible that any soul could be living in such a mass of rubble and twisted steel after the number of rounds fired into this building during the past few days. There was a huge hole where the entire northeast corner had been blown away. The remains of Iwabuchi would never be located. All that was left was the finance building. The Japanese were given a 30-minute ultimatum to surrender by American forces. The announcer poked the captive enemy every 5 minutes during that period. "What do you do now that the man who was standing next to you a few hours ago is dead?" Japanese broadcast by American forces. "Do you want this to be your life? You have 10 minutes left." Only 90 seconds remained. According to one report, at this point, one Jap came literally tumbling down over the rubble in front of the building. He was nearly immediately followed by 12 more, who came to our lines and gave up. More came out of a foxhole and pillbox, increasing the number of people who gave up to 22. The remaining enemy troops were eliminated on March 3rd, after American forces continued to bombard for 2 more days. Robert Ross Smith came to the conclusion that the finance building was in ruins at the end. The parts that had not been destroyed appeared to be standing solely due to habit. It was the end of the Battle of Manila. Once the gunfire had stopped, survivors scrambled from the debris to look for loved ones amidst the city's ruins. Both young and elderly, wealthy and impoverished, had died in the 29-day Battle of Manila. Many had been incinerated by artillery, while others had perished at the steel tip of a bayonet. The Japanese had massacred Russians, Spaniards, Germans, Indians, 2 judges of the Supreme Court, a senator's family, and numerous priests in addition to thousands of Filipinos. In his notebook, lawyer Marcial Lichauco wrote, "The list of known dead that has come to my attention sounds like a who's who of the Philippines." On February 23, 1945, American troops enter Manila's devastated Intramuros neighborhood. One of the world's most war-torn cities was Manila. Iwabuchi's men were nearly completely destroyed in the battle to regain the capital of the Philippines, which claimed 65 Japanese lives. On the other hand, 10 of MacArthur's soldiers were killed and 65 were injured. These figures only represented a small portion of the estimated 1,000 civilians who perished in the conflict. Meanwhile, 32 hospitals, many of which were little more than rudimentary aid stations set up in dirty schools, churches, and even race clubs, were overrun by the injured who flooded the city. Even combat veterans like Major John Carlisle, who commanded a civil affairs squad tasked with gathering food and medical supplies, were taken aback by the carnage. Carlisle told New York Times writer George Jones, You wouldn't believe me if I told you some of the things I have done and seen here in the last few days. The harm went well beyond casualties among people. Together with American artillery, Japanese demolitions had destroyed 613 city blocks, which included 11,000 structures ranging from residential areas to banks and schools. Numerous cultural assets, including centuries-old cathedrals and sculptures and paintings within the Philippine National Library and Museum, were destroyed in the fighting, which also left an estimated 2,000 people homeless. Robert Weigel, an internee from Santo Tomas, said in his diary, "I have witnessed the death of an entire city. In the coming years, a new city might replace it, but it won't look much like the old one." MacArthur's house on top of the Manila Hotel was one of the houses that was destroyed. His enormous library was reduced to ashes. Jean MacArthur was devastated by the loss of his son's newborn book. She wrote a buddy, "You wanted to know about my apartment at the hotel. That, along with practically everything else I know in Manila, is gone." General Yamashita moved out of the northern Luzon mountains and submitted at the conclusion of the war. He was charged with permitting his troops to rape and kill tens of thousands of men, women, and children in Manila and the countryside when he was tried in a battered courtroom in Manila in the fall of 1945. The Tiger of Malaya blamed the devastation on the dead Iwabuchi and denied any knowledge of the atrocities. The prosecution established a circumstantial case that Yamashita could not have been unaware of the crimes because they were too extensive and well-planned, even though investigators were unable to find any documentation linking him to the killings. Lawyers contended that he should have known, at the very least. As MacArthur had directed, Yamashita was hanged on February 23, 1946, without even his uniform or any honors. Manila faced 3 years of Japanese occupation, which destroyed the economy, caused widespread famine, and tore apart the social fabric. Few cities in World War II suffered as much as Manila. The fight to free the city turned out to be an even worse nightmare. Journalist Joan Orendane, who is a member of the Memorare Manila 1945 Foundation, a group of survivors of the Battle of Manila, best encapsulated the sentiment that the war not only cost the Philippines its capital, but also destroyed generations of families, the effects of which continue to affect lives to this day. Orendane recounted, "We had nothing by the end of the war. Our recollections were all that remained of the event. The stench of death, the hunger, the blood, the horrible sounds of bombs, grenades, and gunfire, the massive fires, the smell of charred wood and charred bodies, and the most unsettling sounds of all, the whistling of an impending bomb and the keening over the dead. Those sounds are as distinct to us now as they were back then."